We're really excited to have tonight's speaker, who is a wonderful researcher and writer and a person who is always drawn to topics that are incredibly important to historical understanding, but also contemporary life, and we really appreciate his work. Mark Brown is the Chief Deputy Defender with the Appellate Division of the Office of Public Defense Services. He spent several years teaching political science at Washington State University, Vancouver. Woo! Yes, WSUV. In 2014, he received a Fulbright scholarship to teach at the South China University of Technology School of Law. And in 2017, he co-taught a comparative constitutional law course at Shivaji University College of Law in Kolhapur, Maharashtra, India. And also, most importantly, he is a published author in the Oregon Historical Quarterly. He published a great history of the People's Food Co-op. So please join me in welcoming Mark Brown.
Thank you, Eliza, and I may migrate over this way because that light is hitting me right about here. I can't actually see anyone out there, so we'll see how this works out. And thanks to Mcmenamins for hosting us. It's great to be back here once again. Do want to note, for those of you attorneys who are looking for continuing legal ed credit, you do get a credit for being here. You can drink a beer and get a CLE credit. Might be better. Be sure to sign up in the back, and you can get your complimentary written materials. And so tonight we're going to talk about the dark history of eugenics in Oregon. I didn't know there were so many people interested in eugenics. Yeah, exactly. When I tell people about that, like, you're talking about eugenics, like, yeah, it's kind of really weird and interesting. Anyway, well, we start off with a tale of two boxes. That's how we start. This is the first box, or this is actually a phantom box, if you will. So, as Eliza said, I work for the Office of Public Defense Services. I'm an appellate public defender. One of my jobs I took on a few years ago was going through our archives that we have all our client files for years and years stored in the State Records Building. It's this big warehouse. You wouldn't even know it existed if you didn't go there. I drove past it many times without knowing that. All kinds of cool things there, I'm sure, but all of our files are there, and I'm like, I gotta go through and figure out what files we have, what we need, what we don't need, so forth and so on. So I obtained a list of the boxes that we have there by categories. As I was looking through that list, I came upon a line item that said appeals from the State Board of Eugenics. State Board of Eugenics. First thing I said, why don't I know about the State Board of Eugenics? Then next thing I said, we did appeals from the State Board of Eugenics. So that's what got me down into this, rabbit hole of Oregon eugenics, is I didn't even know it existed. I'm like, oh, if I don't know it existed, probably a lot of people don't know it existed. And ultimately, I actually still haven't gone through those boxes yet. Although I don't think that the boxes on the State Board of Eugenics appeals are in there anymore. I did kind of ask about that, and I'll get to that in a minute. So that's the first box. The second box in our tale of two squares is this box. It's actually, it kind of looks like a rectangle, but it is a box. It's square. And it's a square, nothing too exciting. But if you do this, it becomes does anyone know? The quadrant, good. This is the science part. You can actually get Science Pub credit for this too, because we're going to talk science here for a minute. This is a Punnett square. Anyone remember Punnett squares from biology? Yeah, you remember Punnett squares. So a Punnett square is used by biologists to determine the probability of offspring of a particular genotype or trait. It's really, and I'll read this good statistic and all that, a tabulation of possible combinations of maternal and paternal alleles, which are one of two or more alternative forms of genes that arise by mutation and are found on the same location in chromosome. So that is what you use a Punnett square for. It's to determine hereditary traits. And this is a good example of Punnett square. We're talking basic Mendelian genetics here. Developed by Gregor Mendel, a monk. He developed this in around 1865. It's the foundation of hereditary genetics as we know today. So with the Punnett square, you have heterozygotes and homozygotes. A heterozygote contains only one allele, so the uppercase P's or the lowercase P's. Then you have heterozygotes, which contain a dominant and a recessive allele. So this would be the example of green peas and yellow peas, so Mendel was a monk. He was also a scientist, but he's also a gardener. He loved gardening. He loved it in Portland because everyone gardens here. But he was growing peas once, and so he planted green peas, and a few of the plants produced yellow peas. Like, wait a minute, how could that be? How could I plant green peas and get yellow peas? So he started looking into this, and he experimented as a scientist would, and he determined that some of the peas were hybrids or were heterozygotes, had a dominant trait and a recessive trait. So in the peas, the green was a dominant trait. The green would be represented by the uppercase P, and the yellow is a recessive trait with the lowercase p. And he determined that if you cross two green peas, you're going to get green 75% of the time, and 25% of the time you're going to get yellow, because you have the dominant, which is green. And so when you have the heterozygote, the dominant trait's going to come out. So when you have the uppercase P and the lowercase p, the uppercase P, the dominant trait will always appear. But when you have the two lowercase, the recessive trait will appear. So there's a great example of this in action. So in London, before the Industrial Revolution, there were these white moths everywhere. And people saw the white moths and said, wow, white moths. And then, during the Industrial Revolution, the white moths disappeared and brown moths appeared. People are like, wow, where did the brown moths come from? What happened to our white moths we liked? And then after the Industrial Revolution, London was cleaned up again, and the white moths appeared again. This was confusing to everyone, so they looked into this. And during the Industrial Revolution in London, it got really dirty. A lot of smog, a lot of the soot everywhere. In fact, when we romantically sing about London fog, we're actually singing about the smog of London. So what happened is the white moths, because the walls of buildings were mostly white, the white moths were nicely camouflaged. So the white was a dominant trait, but there was a brown recessive trait in these moths. But whenever the brown moth was born, it stuck out and it got eaten by a predator, so there weren't a lot of brown moths. But then when the buildings got dirty, the white moths stuck out like white moths. And so the white moths got eaten and the brown moths became more dominant. So the brown moth, the brown moth trait, brown coloring, became the dominant trait. And then when they cleaned it up, the brown moths again were eaten because they stuck out, and the white moths again became dominant. So that's how these traits work. There's always a dominant trait, always produces some sort of benefit. And here's a picture of Gregor Mendel, the monk. He was from Moravia, or he was in Moravia. He was Czech by birth, and again, he is the founder of kind of modern genetics and what we understand about hereditary or inheritance of traits. Now that was a science part of it. Now we're getting into the kind of dour old white guy part of it. We started with Charles Darwin. There's Charles Darwin. I actually found a young picture of Charles Darwin, but no one recognizes him when he's young. Everyone recognizes that as Charles Darwin, but he was young one time. Charles Darwin is known for the term survival of the fittest, and he explained how new species arise. And in fact, well, his theory, it was that new species arise when there is some external force that makes for a new dominant trait, and that or a species will fill a niche, and that is a very simplification of Charles Darwin. Next to Charles Darwin, we have Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is actually the one who actually came up with the term survival of the fittest, but Charles Darwin is known for it. Herbert Spencer actually developed a theory of social evolution that predated Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, but Charles Darwin is always the one who gets credit for it. Herbert Spencer's theories are known as social Darwinism. And like I said, he developed his theory before Darwin developed his, but Darwin had better press or something. And so he got the name for it. But what it did is it applied the same thinking to societies, in that his theory was that societies develop from simple to complex, and humans develop from simple to complex. So this creates a hierarchy of societies and of humans. Of course, in his theory, the Northern Europeans were the highest society. They were in the hierarchy on the top. And tribal society was sort of on the bottom, and every society was kind of striving to move up. And so it created this hierarchy of societies. Then we move to the third dour white guy, Sir Francis Galton. He was actually a cousin of Charles Darwin. Their grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, who was a famous scientist. Francis Galton was actually a statistician, but he's all over the place. I come upon him in all kinds of weird places. He was sort of a polymath, as they say. He did a lot of things. In fact, I was doing research on fingerprint identification for a case I was working on, and Francis Galton was the kind of guy who figured out modern fingerprinting techniques. Who knew? But he read The Origin of Species, and he applied that theory of evolution to the inheritance of abilities and characteristics. So Charles Darwin was talking about, inheritance of physical attributes, blue eyes or curly hair or skin tone, whereas Galton said, no, it's even further than that. You can inherit abilities and characteristics. And he was a father of eugenics. That was a basis of eugenics, that you inherit all of these abilities and characteristics. He actually coined the term eugenics. It comes from the Greek terms eu, which is good, and genos, which is birth, and he defined it as well-born of good stock and of noble race. And he stated that the aim of eugenics is to represent each class or sect by its best specimens. That done, leave them to work out their common civilization in their own way. Now there's two branches, two large categories of eugenics. And mostly people think about the negative eugenics, but there's actually positive eugenics, which is what Galton had in mind. And positive eugenics encourages the fittest to have more children and to look at family histories before you choose a mate to make for a stronger stock. Whereas negative eugenics calls for the culling of the worst from the breeding population. So very different, and we'll look at both of them and how they sort of played out in the bigger scheme of things. But the negative eugenics was more what we see with the American eugenics movement, which we'll be looking at, and also, of course, with Nazi Germany, took the negative eugenics to the nth degree. So this brings us to eugenics. And this is the logo of the Second International Congress of Eugenics. And eugenics was promoted as a science of eugenics. And in fact, it was taught in schools. And it was noted as a science that deals with the improvements as by controlled human mating of hereditary qualities of race and breed. So interestingly, this was promoted by a number of cattle breeders, and in fact, one of the important books on eugenics was written by Luther Burbank. Luther Burbank is known for breeding plums, essentially, and other fruit. He did a lot of our modern fruit came from Luther Burbank, and their theory was if we're doing this for fruit, we can do the same thing for humans, and we could breed for the best qualities in humans. So that is a lot of the root of the American eugenics movement. But the theory goes that in the past, there was natural selection. So people who were born, individuals who were born who had weaknesses, they were ill, some kind of weakness, they were culled from the population because there wasn't modern medicine. And so they didn't breed, they didn't pass on their bad genes, as it were. But then modern medicine came, and we created modern medicine. We invented all this great medicine, but that means that people who otherwise would have been culled from the population at a young age were surviving and were living to become adults, which meant that they were passing along what they saw as these bad genes. And so the idea of eugenics is that humans have to step in order to do what nature had been doing, what we sort of short-circuited when we created modern medicine. So we must step in to kind of mimic these natural processes. And you can see eugenics is a self-direction of human evolution. And the eugenics movement really took hold in the United States in the early 1900s, and it really what it really did was it gave scientific foundation to an isolationist, xenophobic, and racist society. So people who already had these views were like, hey, now our views are supported by science. This is all scientific. In fact, by 1914, Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, and Brown had eugenics courses that they taught in their biology department. And most high school biology texts presented eugenics as legitimate science through the 1950s. Some of you may actually remember having textbooks that talked about eugenics in your biology textbook. And in fact, I think the idea still persists in society. This idea that people are superior to others and people should pass on good genes. I think it does still exist, not overtly as it did then, but we'll explore that a little bit at the end. This is the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. This really was the heart of the eugenics movement in the United States. This area, Cold Spring Harbor, it's now known as the Cold Spring Harbor Lab. It's actually a very well-respected genetic lab and biology lab. A lot of research is done there. But back then it was started as the Eugenics Record Office, and it actually founded, or the funding came from Mrs. E.E. Harriman. It was all railroad money, very wealthy individual, and the purpose was to collect data to support the science of eugenics. And this was done mostly by taking family histories, because you can't really experiment on people. So they would go out into the field, they'd have volunteers and staff would go out in the field and take family histories. So they'd talk to someone who's in prison maybe, and they'd say, what is your family history? To see if there was a genetic trait for the criminality gene, I guess. And also promoted reductions in immigration and eugenics laws. So one of the aspects of eugenics movement was to limit immigration, as we'll see, and the Eugenics Record Office was promoting and was actually writing laws to go into effect for the national government to limit immigration. Interestingly, another place that promoted eugenics was the Race Betterment Foundation, and that was started by J.H. Kellogg of the cereal company. So eugenics was actually quite popular at that time. This is actually the two men who ran the records office, Charles Davenport and Henry Laughlin. Charles Davenport is on your right and Laughlin's on the left. And they both came from the American Breeders Association. Again, this connection between breeding animals or fruit and the eugenics movement. So as I said, the eugenics movement included immigration. It actually had 3 lines, and we'll look at each one of those lines in turn. The first line was the immigration policy I mentioned. The second line are the Fitter Families and Better Babies contests, which we'll get to. And then the third is a forced sterilization, which is what most people think of if they think of eugenics. So we start with immigration. And really, America, if you think about it, the United States has always limited immigration. We've always been a country that says, we want to keep our land pure. As I say, to preserve the American race, which means really the Anglo-Saxon race. It's an interesting side note. So I lived in North Idaho for a number of years when the Aryan Nation was big there. And one thing and the Aryan Nation, of course, was advocating for a white nation. One thing that always seemed peculiar to me is Aryan actually refers to people from Persia, from the Persian region. Aryan, Iran, comes from the term Iranian, or Aryan. So I always wanted to kind of knock on their door and say, hey, guys, you kind of didn't get it right. But they had guns and I didn't, so I did not do that. Anyway, so in the late 1800s, there was an increase in immigration to the United States because we needed labor, because it was the Industrial Revolution, a lot of factories, and so we needed people to run the factories, to work in the factories. So labor was important, a lot of immigration. But by the late 1800s, there was a series of economic downturns into the 1900s. Basically, had to do with the monopolies and all kinds of economics that I won't get into, but it was blamed on the immigrants. especially the Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans were blamed on it because the people, the middle class, upper class, saw like all of these children being born and saw all these services that they're asking for and said, this is why our country is in economic depression, because our economy is being dragged down by these individuals. So there's a push to limit immigration. Additional to that, the birth rates for the middle class and upper class in the United States, i.e. the Anglo-Saxons, was falling, and the birth rate for the immigrants was rising. So they were looking and saying, at some point, it's not going to be a white nation anymore. So we have to do something about that. We can't sit down and just take it as it comes to us. So there was concern that the racial purity of the country was going to be diluted. And they went back to Spencer's social Darwinism and said, hey, this is what's happening here. You know, if our race is superior, but if we are mixing with these other inferior races, we're going to bring our race down. They saw Germans and other Northern Europeans as more developed, more industrious, more, you know, thrifty and so forth. Another thing going on historically was the Russian Revolution, 1917. And so the Russian Revolution had the upper class, you know, really nervous because everyone thought they would spread to the United States. In fact, there was a pretty strong communist movement in the United States. And the upper class, middle class blamed the Eastern European Jews and the Italians, the radicals, for bringing this, and they were afraid that they were going to bring their radical ideas to the United States and cause a revolution here. This led to the National Origins Act of 1924 and the Asian Exclusionary Act of 1924. Now, there's pretty much for most of the United States history up until recent times, Asians have been excluded from the country, except when labor was needed. So, for example, we need to build railroads on the West Coast. We need labor. Let them in, and then when you're done with them, you know, exclude them again. So that was traditional in this country. So there were quotas put on different countries, how many people could come in each year. And previously, for Eastern and Southern European immigrants, it was 45% of all immigrants could be from that area. It was lowered to 15%. And for Asians, it was 0. So you can see that it was targeting specific groups to keep them out. In fact, when President Coolidge signed the acts, he said, "America must remain American." How could a president say that? I mean, never mind. And many of these restrictions remained in place until the mid-1960s, these very strict quotas, which there happened to be a president of the United States who happened to be growing up about the time when these quotas were being taken away, which may lead to some understanding of things today. Anyway, we'll get into that maybe at the end. Also worth noting is that many states also had strict laws against interracial marriage, and that was to preserve racial purity. You know, we want to, we know, this is as a theory, we know that these Eastern European Jews, that these African Americans, they're coming in and they want to dilute our gene pool, so we have to make laws to prevent that from happening. And in fact, it wasn't until 1958 that the US Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional. So again, this is not ancient history we're talking about. So that was the first phase, the first part, kind of the first prong of American eugenics was this immigration limitations. The second part is the fitter families and better babies contests. And I told you this was coming up. So we'll start with the Fitter Family Program. So the Fitter Family Program was, a lot of times, and you can see there's from the Georgia State Fair, I think that one was from Kansas, if I remember correctly. At most state fairs, there were Fitter Family Pavilions, and families could go there, and they'd go there with their family history, and they would fill out a form. Yep, there's a form right there. An examination form, and they would fill out all this information, and they would be evaluated. There would be someone who would evaluate them by certain criteria and would determine if they were a fitter family. If they were fitter family, they got one of these little medallions. And they got a certificate also. The medallion actually says, it's not easy to read, it says, "Ye have a goodly heritage." So if you belong to a fitter family and your son or daughter was of marrying age, you would look for another fitter family. You'd look for a certificate because you would want to ensure that your genes are carried on in a good family. You would want your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to have these good genes. So the families were judged basically on their members' mental and physical health, productivity, and appearance. And the contests were also used to promote family planning because they wanted people who were fitter families to have more babies, to make for more people with goodly heritage, as it says. The other side of this was the Better Babies contests. And these also occurred in state fairs. This is actually an article from the 1913, I believe, the Salem newspaper, which I noticed today looking at it. Why drink water when you can drink Salem beer? With today's water in Salem, that might actually be true. Anyway, so this is noting an article from 1913 announcing the schedule for the Eugenics Pavilion at the Oregon State Fair. And it does quote up on the side, you can see the schedule there, and it says that babies examined from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. There were also lectures about, raising children with science was part of this movement, learning how to use science to make your baby healthier. So the Better Babies, it happened, these contests happened at the state fair. So there'd be county fairs, and the county fairs would also have their Better Baby contests, and they would send their best baby to the state fair. And so I liked it. We've all been to the state fair. You go into like the cow pavilion, you look at the cows. To me, they look like cows, but someone looked and said, "This is like the best cow," and gives it a blue ribbon. You go into, and you look at it, and you're like, "Oh, these nice cows." And then you go into the pig pavilion, you look at the pigs, and the same thing. A blue ribbon, that must be a really good pig for someone who knows pigs. I actually like to picture the Better Baby contest and the Eugenics Pavilion to have like the babies lined up like that. I don't think it was like that. But I think what it was they had like examination rooms where doctors examined the babies, and they had criteria that was developed by scientists that these are the best proportions for a baby. So they'd measure baby's head, they'd measure limb length, body length, weight, all kinds of things like that. Also skin tone, to make sure that was healthy. Now, interestingly, so many of you have probably had kids, and you bring your kids when they're really young to the doctor, and you find out, oh, my child is in the 85th percentile, right? That comes right out of this. So you're laughing about the Better Babies, but we still sort of have that. We still sort of have, these are the criteria for the best of the babies. But anyway, these were contests in the state fair, different than going to your doctor, understandably. And so the judges took criteria, and here's a little note that Governor West has consented to make the presentation of the grand champion trophies to be awarded to the highest point babies in the eugenics test at the baby show, which is to be one of the great features of the state fair in Salem. So Governor West presented the trophy, and it went to Jane Cancel. This is one of the most disturbing slides that I have. And every time I put it on, I'm like, is this child pornography? But it was in the Oregonian, so I figured it's okay. But I mean, so this was the winner, and yes, she is naked, and she is in the seductive, kind of Hollywood-esque starlet pose. So you're not imagining that. In the Sunday Oregonian, so you over your morning coffee, you have that. Now, Jane Cancel won the best baby of 1913. An interesting side story to Jane Cancel. So when I was doing the research to this, well, I'll step back. My last presentation here was on the Young v. Oregon, a U.S. Supreme Court case that came out of an Oregon communist named Dirk de Young, who was arrested for basically being a communist and convicted and sentenced to 7 years, and his conviction was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. A little backstory. So when I was reading this article, I'm like, Jane Kanzler, why does the name Kanzler sound familiar? It turns out that her father, who was mentioned as an attorney, a Multnomah County attorney, was the judge who sentenced Dirk de Young to his sentence. I'm like, wow, that's kind of a weird coincidence. These two kind of independent projects. Anyway, so Jane won, and the article notes that Jane's coloring is one of her greatest attractions. Her skin is fair, her cheeks rosy, her eyes brown. And actually, the article does also note that she comes from good stock. Her mother is, I think, English, Irish, and her father is Germanic. So, you know, it checked the boxes. But the article also goes into the science of raising a child. So a lot of the article is about how Jane's mother has raised her. She used science. She fed her certain foods that had certain vitamins. And she gave her physical activity to do. She also didn't let her go to the movies because it was all stale air in the movie theaters. So the article actually does have, we laugh at it, but it does have a lot of tips that you read down, like, oh, that was probably really good advice at that time to do these things. One of my next projects is going to figure out what became of her, because I already have the title, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which I think might be a good movie. I don't know. Anyway, future project. And that brings us to the third line of eugenics, which is forced sterilization, which is what we're going to be talking about the rest of the time. And this is that idea of negative eugenics. The other stuff was a lot of positive eugenics, this idea that whether, now it sounds crazy, but that we need to, through science, raise stronger, healthier people. This is the negative eugenics, which is about culling those who you don't want to be in the, be mating and having children. This is actually a 1913 letter from Theodore Roosevelt to Charles Davenport. He had read Charles Davenport's writings. Charles Davenport sent it to him, and he sent this letter. In it, he notes that it is really extraordinary that our people refuse to apply to human beings such elementary knowledge as every farmer is obliged to apply to his own stock breeding. And then he explains how crazy it is to permit unlimited breeding of the worst stock, while it encourages the best stock to have small families. So again, this idea that the wrong people are having lots of kids, which is what Theodore Roosevelt was pointing out here. And this was, again, the time when states were really starting to look at eugenics laws, forced sterilization laws. Many of those laws were coming out of the records office, eugenics records office I mentioned earlier, were writing draft legislation, sending them out to different states. The first forced sterilization law actually was in Indiana in 1907, and it called for forced sterilization of degenerates. Which brings us to Oregon, and one of the most interesting characters in this story is Dr. Bithynia Owens Adair. She lived from 1840 to 1926. She came to Oregon in 1843 as a wee little kid. She married at 14. She was a mother at 16. She divorced later on. She became a doctor. She was the first doctor to practice in probably the Pacific Northwest, and one of the first in the country, female doctor, to practice in the Pacific Northwest. She married again in 1894, and she divorced again in 1907. She became a doctor in Oregon in 1881, or she set up practice in Oregon in 1881. She was a really strong advocate for women's rights. You may have come upon her name if you've studied women's suffrage in Oregon, temperance movement in Oregon, both very progressive movements of the time, and forced sterilization was one of her strongest advocacies. She was advocating for that for many, many years. And you could read the slide here. The greatest curse of the race comes through our vicious, criminal, insane class. Those inferior and dangerous citizens should be dealt with not by chloroform or strangulation, but by the science of surgery. For if their power to reproduce themselves were rendered null, a tremendous important step in advance would have been taken, not only without injury to life, but often with a positive benefit to the victims themselves. This was a letter she wrote to the Oregonian. Now it's interesting, I was reading this today, and I said, it's interesting that she used the term victims, because she's talking about how it benefits them, but yet she still saw them as victims. Now people are surprised when they hear that this eugenics movement was a progressive movement, because in our modern kind of thinking, it doesn't seem to compute. But the idea behind it was that if a person was feeble-minded, was deemed feeble-minded, they had to be institutionalized, because otherwise they would have a lot of children, the children would become wards of the state, and then they would cost money for the state, and then those bad genes, those feeble-minded genes, would be passing along to their children. So if they could be sterilized, then they can't have children, and then we don't have to institutionalize them anymore. So the progressive thought was that we don't want people to be institutionalized. We want them to live in society. And how do we do that? How can we do that? Well, we can do that by sterilizing them. And so that was how this was a progressive movement. It was also seen as a benefit to the person because they can live in society. And it's a benefit to society because it costs less for them to be out in society, being a productive member of society, than to be in an institution. So she became the strongest advocate in Oregon for the forced sterilization of individuals. And in 1909, the legislature actually passed the Owens-Adair Human Sterilization Act. And in pushing for that, the Oregonian, which was a strong supporter of forced sterilization, in an editorial asserted that we breed criminals in this country, and we'll probably continue to do so until Mrs. Dr. Owens-Adair succeeds in getting her sterilization laws on the books. So the Oregonian was a big supporter. But the governor at the time vetoed the legislation. He was concerned, he said, that a bill departing so radically from established methods in Oregon ought to be skillfully framed to remove any ground for misunderstanding or misconstruction of its terms. I am not entirely satisfied that all of the class named in the act ought to be submitted to such harsh treatment. So he wasn't against eugenics, he wasn't against forced sterilization, he was just concerned that maybe we have people in here who shouldn't be in here. The next, a couple legislative sessions later, in 1913, the Sterilization Act of 1913 was passed and was signed by Governor Oswald West. It was the same year that Governor West presented baby Jane with her trophy, with her winner's cup. There was opposition to that, and the opposition actually put a ballot measure on the next election cycle to repeal the Sterilization Act of 1913. And this is where it gets weird again. The proponents of the anti-sterilization initiative was the Anti-Vaccination League of America. So the anti-vaccination folks were against forced sterilization. In fact, Laura Little, who was a leader of the anti-vaccination movement nationwide, led the Anti-Sterilization League in Oregon. And they were formed to get this ballot repealed by law. Laura Little was kind of interesting. Her son died when he was a child, and she blamed the smallpox vaccine for her child's death, and she distrusted medical professionals. She considered doctors to be little more than power and profit-hungry oppressors who, operating with faulty ideas, only made people sicker. So she said, this science, I don't trust it. It's like the vaccinations. And then in response to the argument that, but look, you have these criminals and they breed and they make more criminals and it's all about genes, she pointed to Australia and Virginia. She said, hey, wait a minute. Look, Australia and Virginia were started as penal colonies. If that was true, then everyone in Australia would be a criminal. And yet, and Virginia, same thing, yet we have good, upstanding citizens there. So therefore, it can't be correct. And actually, the Oregon Sterilization League won. The Sterilization Act of 1913 was repealed by a vote of like 53,000 to 48,000. So they were successful, but that didn't stop the legislature from trying again. And in 1917, they passed the Sterilization Act of 1917, which became law on February 19th of 1917, so 101 plus years ago. I think I was giving this presentation once, like on the 100th anniversary of that, and I noticed it as I was giving the presentation. So the Sterilization Act of 1917 was passed, was signed by the governor, and didn't have a challenge. So what changed? You know, just a few years earlier, there was a successful challenge to the Sterilization Act. I think a couple of things happened. World War I was going on. We had just really entered into World War I, so that was what the news was about. So I think really people were not paying attention to this at that time. There was also an increase in immigration, especially people immigrating from the war going on in Europe. And there was, again, the Russian Revolution had just was percolating up at this time, and you know, there was concern that this was going to happen here. So I think a lot of things were going on that allowed this to slide through. So what did the law do? First, the law created the State Board of Eugenics, which I referred to early on as why didn't I know about this? The State Board of Eugenics consisted of the warden of the Oregon State Penitentiary, the superintendent of institution for the feeble-minded. There was such a thing, it later became known as Fairview Industrial Training Center or something, but it was initially the superintendent of the, or the institution of for the feeble-minded. Also on the board was the secretary of the State Board of Health, the superintendent of the state hospital, and the superintendent of the Eastern Oregon State Hospital. So you notice there's no one with like a doctor or anything in their name. The Sterilization Act required that the board review quarterly reports of all, quote, feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, habitual criminals, moral degenerates, and sexual perverts, who are persons potential to producing offspring who, because of inheritance of inferior or antisocial traits, would probably become a social menace or ward of the state. So the board would, each of the institutions would submit a record to the board, review this record, and the board would review the record. They'd look at the mental and physical condition of the individual. They'd look at their personal records. They'd look at their family traits and family histories. And they would determine whether the person would produce children with an inherited tendency to feeble-mindedness, insanity, epilepsy, criminality, degeneracy, and had no probability of improvement. Then the board shall order sterilization. The options were castration or vasectomy in men and removal of the ovaries or cutting of the fallopian tubes for women. So, statutes define terms. Moral degenerates and sexual perverts were statutorily defined as those who are addicted to the practice of sodomy or the crime against nature, or to other gross, bestial, and perverted sexual habits and practices prohibited by statute. At that time, homosexuality was prohibited by statute. And that's a lot of what this was targeting. The LGBTQ gene, maybe? So I've said, when I've given this presentation, I have to be like, wait a minute. Gay and lesbians, they're not going to be producing offspring, so what's the problem? But understanding, and I thought about that, I'm like, yeah, well, but looking back at the history, most gay and lesbian individuals were closeted back then. They had to be. And so they had families, they had children, and so that was the concern, that they were secretly, passing along this gene for degeneracy, as they said. Habitual criminals were determined to be those who have been convicted 3 or more times of a felony in courts of any state and sentenced to serve in the penitentiary thereof. The criminality gene. And this actually goes to the misunderstanding between nurture and nature. So they would look, and they'd look at the family history and say, look, your grandfather was a criminal, your father was a criminal, and you're a criminal. Therefore, it must be hereditary. And so if we can just stop these individuals from passing on that gene, we will weed that criminality gene out of our society. And then we have feeble-mindedness. This is a picture of the State Institution for the Feeble-Minded, again, later known as the Fairview Training Center. And it no longer exists. I think it burned down in like 2000 or something, and they tore it down. Feeble-minded had no statutory definition. And it was really vaguely defined. It didn't really have a clear definition. Low intelligence was one definition. Behavior that offends really was behavior that offends middle-class sensibilities. Social workers, judges, and doctors looked and said, oh, that offends me, therefore you must be feeble-minded. Or people considered too physically or mentally deficient to resist inappropriate activities, such as chronic masturbation, rape, child molestation, and, quote, crimes against nature. In women, so in men, a lot of this was targeted towards homosexual men. In women, it was targeted towards promiscuous women who were sexually promiscuous. Also, immigrants were tested at entry points for feeble-mindedness. Now, they'd be tested in like English, and most of them couldn't speak English, and so if you're feeble-minded, we're sending you back because we don't allow feeble-minded people in. So interestingly, from this whole era and this whole idea is where IQ tests came out of. Think about an IQ test for a minute. We're putting a number on someone's intelligence. So that person can say, I have an IQ of whatever, IQ now 180. And it's, again, that superiority thing. I mean, how do you put a number on intelligence? Yeah, we use it all the time, just offhand, IQ. Your IQ is this, your IQ is that. Interesting to think about these things when you start delving into this area. So, one key point of the Sterilization Act of 1917 was that it was for the betterment of the individual. It was not punishment. No person shall be emasculated under the authority of the act except that such operations shall be found to be necessary to improve the physical, mental, neural, or psychic condition of the inmate. That's important because if it was punishment, then it would be susceptible to constitutional challenges, cruel and unusual punishment. But if it's not punishment, if it's for the betterment of the individual, then it's a medical practice. And you can't challenge medical practices as being constitutionally cruel and unusual. So that was a key part of the provision to prevent it from being unconstitutional. Now, unfortunately, most of the records of the State Board of Eugenics have been lost. And I don't think they were destroyed for any, like, oh, we got to kind of get rid of these things so no one knows, but I think they were just lost over time. You know, records disappear. Although, in 2002, the governor's office reported that they found hundreds of files of the State Board of Eugenics. I've never been able to find those files. Still working on it, actually, but they claim to be there. But like I said, most of the records, as far as I know, have been lost. Like I said, we seem to have had some files, but probably they wouldn't be very helpful because the State Public Defender's Office wasn't created until 1964. So they were not in existence for most of the time when most of this was happening. But not all is lost, as I say, because Harry Laughlin, remember we saw his picture at the beginning standing next to Mr. Davenport, he published a book in 1922, The Eugenical Sterilization in the United States, a report of the Psychopathic Laboratory of the Municipal Court of Chicago. The Municipal Court of Chicago had a psychopathic laboratory? I still have not figured that one out. But what this did, it went through state by state, what each state was doing with eugenics. It had a copy of the laws, it had interviews with people who are involved with these boards, and it also had information on certain cases. So some of the records have been preserved through this document, and through the magic of Google, it's actually online now. And Oregon, there are 2 cases talked about, but they actually interview one of the wardens about the sterilization, and the warden of the Oregon State Penitentiary in 1921 said, "I believe this is the only way to handle feeble-minded, insane sexual perverts, etc. It stops the breed, which is a desired result, although the effect on the individual is usually very beneficial." But it also has information on 2 cases that the Board of Eugenics heard. One is the case of Chester Vanderpool. Chester Vanderpool, according to a report of the warden, had previously served 2 terms in the Oregon Reform School and twice escaped. He was actually really, really good at escaping. So here, he was convicted in 1913 for, I think he broke into someone's house and stole their gun. You can see down here, Vanderpool is sentenced. A sentence of from 1 to 7 years in the state penitentiary was imposed yesterday on Chester Vanderpool by Circuit Judge Morrow. Vanderpool entered a plea of guilty to a charge of larceny in a dwelling, the specific charge being that he had stolen a rifle from Thomas Peltier. So he was convicted. He liked to escape, though, like the warden said, he escaped twice while in juvenile reform school. He also escaped in 1913, used a rowboat to escape down the Willamette River. Just kind of floated away. But he was obviously captured because he escaped again in 1917. And actually, I like this line. Let me just turn around here. A convict escaped last Sunday morning. Another convict, they escape all the time. Another convict in the person of Chester Vanderpool has bidden farewell to the state prison without leaving any word as to his destination. I like how they wrote back then. So he disappeared, took off. Unfortunately, Chester Vanderpool apparently was a strong believer in the right to vote, because Sheriff W.L. Campbell today recaptured Chester Vanderpool, who escaped from the penitentiary at Salem on January 29th. Vanderpool has resided at Netards, thank you, in the county for several months, and today attempted to vote. His vote was challenged, and he was on his way to the city ostensibly to learn whether he could vote when taken. So Chester Vanderpool should have said, well, maybe I won't vote in this election. So his file came in front of the board of, the State Board of Eugenics. And the report said that it appears that the prisoner is a victim of unfortunate ancestral conditions from which he can never escape. His mother is feeble-minded, and his career has been one of continuous difficulty, sometimes not criminal in its tendency, but always disobedient and unmanageable. Disobedient and unmanageable sounds like half of my staff. Hopefully there's not many of them here today. And they did order him on January 7th of 1918 to be sterilized by vasectomy. The other case we know information on from that book is the case of Jacob Kline. Jacob Kline farmed on Solvay Island for many years. Actually, the picture is kind of interesting. Let's see, right here, that little baby is Jacob Kline right there. And that is his grave marker. So he farmed on Solvay Island for a number of years. He was accused of criminal assault of his daughter in 1904, but he was never convicted. He later divorced and remarried and moved to Glendale in Douglas County. And he and his wife adopted a daughter. He was convicted of raping his adopted daughter, and he received a sentence of 4 to 10 years for statutory rape. And his file came in front of the Board of Eugenics. The warden reported that Kline is sexually perverted and potential parent of offspring who, because of inheritance of inferior or antisocial traits, would probably become a menace to, or ward of the state. He was 66 at the time. I don't know how many kids he was going to have after that. But the report by the warden said that, I hereby report to you Jacob Kline, feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, habitual criminal, moral degenerate, or sexual pervert, to wit, sexual pervert, who is a person potential to producing offspring who, because of inheritance of inferior or antisocial traits, would probably become a social menace or a ward of the state. And the board did order that he be sterilized by a vasectomy in January 27th of 1921. However, he challenged that order. You can see, here's the article, "The constitutionality of sterilization is attacked." Like this, the board called autocratic, I'd say something like that. State health body assailed by Portland attorney. Commission and Eugenics subsidiary declared to control from cradle to grave. And it was actually successful, his challenge. The court held that it violated equal protection rights because it just targeted a certain group of individuals and not everyone. And they said that violated equal protection. Essentially, they're only targeting inmates and not the whole population. And if it was for health reasons, then it would benefit for everyone to be subject to the State Board of Eugenics. And so it was overturned as unconstitutional. The court said, "We are of the opinion that the 1917 statute is unconstitutional because it clearly violates the provisions of the state and federal constitution prohibiting class legislation, equal protection, for the reason that it confined its operations to the inmates of certain state institutions." And that apparently was never appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court, because I've never found an opinion. But interestingly, just a side note, Judge Percy Kelly later did serve on the Oregon Supreme Court. And so at that time, this is again from that book I mentioned earlier, these are the numbers of people who had been sterilized under this law up until when it was struck down as unconstitutional. Now, what's interesting about the numbers that always strikes me is, for the males, the number of castrations. Because they had two. Most states actually did mostly vasectomies. And so I've pondered this, actually looked into it, and there's two theories I have as to why so many castrations in Oregon. The first is that it really did target homosexual men, gay men, and that they weren't just not wanting them to have children, but they wanted to sort of emasculate them, that it was purposely for that reason. The other theory I have is that there were a lot of reports of sodomy in prison, and so this was targeting at reducing that issue in prison. But it is definitely startling to see those numbers. Actually, let's back up a minute. In 1923, the legislature actually passed a new Sterilization Act. And the new Sterilization Act it was pretty much the same as the old one, except that under the new act, sterilization would be by court order only. So the State Board of Eugenics would make a report to the court, and the court would have an evidentiary hearing and determine whether to have that the person gets sterilized or not. But otherwise, there were no changes, same definitions involved. Around this time, there was concern nationwide that the laws were going to be struck down as unconstitutional. So a case came out of Virginia, Buck v. Bell. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was actually a set-up case. Carrie Bell, who was seen right there with her mother, or Carrie Buck, rather, who was seen with her mother, Emma Buck, in this picture. She was determined to be feeble-minded. They said that she had an excessive interest in sex. Her mother was also feeble-minded and was institutionalized. And Carrie had a child who, at the age of 1, an expert, in quotes, determined that the child of 1 was also feeble-minded. I'm not sure how you could determine that, but the child was determined to be feeble-minded. What's sad about this story is Carrie Buck was actually a very good student. She was like a B-plus student, very smart, very social, very vivacious. She was living with a family who I think were relatives, if I remember correctly. And one of the relatives raped her when she was about 16, and she had a child. And so the family didn't want this kind of embarrassment, so they told us, they reported to the state that she is feeble-minded. Look, she's sexually promiscuous. And so she was sent there, and she was determined to be feeble-minded. There was a challenge to that, and it went up to the US Supreme Court with an opinion written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who not only gets the award for the best mustache of a Supreme Court justice, but he was also a Civil War veteran, and that, I think, is important to understand how he came out on this. He was wounded 3 times in the Civil War. One, I think, he got like shot through the neck or something terrible like that. And he saw many of his friends die in the Civil War. He came from a very well-educated Boston family. They were known as the Boston Brahmins, that group of very well-educated Boston families. Also, at this time, when the opinion was written, World War I was in recent past with, many Americans having died in the war. And so ultimately, in a 3-page opinion, the court upheld the constitutionality of forced sterilization. I'll let you read that for a minute because it's important to read that passage. Three generations of imbeciles are enough. And what strikes me, and it was a short opinion, it was just a 3-page opinion that reiterated the findings of the doctor. There was also a recent case that cited Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which upheld the constitutionality of forced vaccinations. There was a challenge to forced vaccinations, and that case decided that it was constitutional, in that it was constitutional because it benefited society, and sometimes the people in society, in civilized societies, have to give up certain rights for the good of society. And that's where Jacobson v. Massachusetts came out. And this part of this paragraph seems to follow that line, that this is the best thing for society, and therefore individuals should have to be willing to undergo these procedures to benefit society. But it's also interesting, we have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. Again, referring to World War II and the Civil War. Interestingly enough, if anyone's ever seen Judgment at Nuremberg, the movie, I think it's the defense attorney for one of the defendants reads this to a witness and says, "Do you recognize that?" The person says no, and he's like, "It was from your US Supreme Court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes." And it's true that Nazi Germany used a lot of the American eugenics movement and thought to take it to the next step as it did. So that opinion really kind of kick-started the interest in forced sterilization, because now the states knew that this is constitutional, we can move forward with this. The interest peaked in the 1930s, coinciding with a peak in kind of the pre-World War II Red Scare, communist scare that targeted Italians and Eastern European Jews. And there was a big push for increase in sterilization. Interestingly, and I just came upon this little fact yesterday when I was looking back at my notes. In Portland and Salem in 1935, there was an exhibit entitled Eugenics in New Germany. And it was, as you would imagine, an exhibit that was very popular. It was at the YMCA in Salem was where it was presented. It presented what the eugenics in Germany is doing, the benefits to society that the eugenics movement in New Germany in 1935. And one theory is that really kick-started, that had traveled throughout the country, and really kick-started the movement saying, look, Germany's doing these great things, and we should be following along. So here's a quote from Rufus Holman, who was the state treasurer. More sterilization urged, he wrote in the Oregonian. Holman later became a senator in Oregon in 1938 for one term, very conservative. He was defeated by Wayne Morse, for those of you who like those things. He was an isolationist, he was anti-union, he was pro-Japanese internment, and he was also the great uncle of Oregon Supreme Court Justice Ralph Holman, but very much a reactionary figure. In 1935, the legislature amended, they had amended the statute many times, but in 1935 they amended it once again, and they stated that their purpose was to lower the cost of prison and mental institutions. This was during the Great Depression, and they were looking at, wow, these prisons are really expensive. The 1923 law, as I said, required a court order for sterilization. 1935 amended that and removed the consent requirement and court order, so either the person could consent under the 23 law or there'd have to be a court order. Now, most people consented because they'd say, you know, if you agree to this, we will release you, and that was deemed to be voluntary consent. But 1935 law only required the individual to bring a lawsuit to challenge the board's decision. So the board would make the decision, and the individual would have to bring a lawsuit to challenge that decision. So that was one of the changes in order to increase the rate of sterilization. In fact, Governor Charles Martin in 1935 said, "I will not pardon from the state penitentiary persons convicted of sex crimes unless the prisoner voluntarily submits to sterilization." Governor Martin, who was a Democrat, was a strong supporter for sterilization. He was actually a retired Army Major General, very anti-communist. A quote that I found from him said, "The Negro is of very little importance. The average Negro is not by any means equal to the average white man." Again, we're back to the social Darwinist kind of theory, and that some are superior to others. Within a year, actually, Governor Martin offered a plan to grant executive clemency to all state penitentiary convicts sentenced for sex crimes if they would voluntarily submit. So if you submit to sterilization, then I will grant you clemency and release you. And he made good on the promise. He actually did release quite a few individuals if they agreed. In 1942, a new challenge was made to the eugenics law to the United States Supreme Court. This was from an Oklahoma case, Skinner v. Oklahoma. And by the 1940s, the interest in eugenics and forced sterilization had diminished significantly, probably because of what we were learning about what was going on in Germany at the time. Hitler's final solution, and that it was based on the American eugenics program. I think we started looking inward and looking at what we were doing. But in Skinner v. Oklahoma, the issue was whether the Oklahoma law violated equal protection. Because the Oklahoma law said that for certain crimes you would get sterilized. So if you were a bank robber and you robbed $1,000, you were eligible for sterilization, but if you embezzled $1,000, then you would not be. So very clearly, white-collar crimes, we're going to say those are excluded. Now, I'll pause for a moment to read this slide again and think about Buck v. Bell. So clearly something had changed from the 1920s to the early 1940s. This was only Buck v. Bell was 1927, so it was not that many years later. The world had changed in that time. This was written, incidentally, the opinion was written by Justice William Douglas. And so this didn't affect Oregon's law because Oregon didn't have that sort of exclusion for certain crimes. And it also didn't overturn Buck v. Bell, which actually has never been overturned forced sterilization is arguably still constitutional under the Buck v. Bell decision. But it did create strict scrutiny for forced sterilization laws. For those of you who are lawyers, that is the highest level of scrutiny that a court will give to a law to see if it's constitutional. So that was an important aspect of this decision. In 1967, the State Board of Eugenics, the legislature renamed the Oregon State Board of Eugenics to be the Board of Social Protection. But in their defense, it wasn't just cosmetic. It now had a faculty member for the University of Oregon Medical School, which later became OHSU, a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker, and a member of a mental health organization. So it wasn't just a cosmetic name change, it definitely did have a substantive change. One of the last substantive opinions, court opinions in Oregon on the state-sanctioned or state-forced sterilization, I should say, is Cook v. State. Nancy Ray Cook was removed from her home at 13 as a result of physical and sexual abuse. For the next 4 years, she bounced from Kline foster home to state hospital to Hillcrest School to the juvenile detention facilities. She was aggressive and hostile, verbal threats to others. She had self-inflicted injuries. She continued to run away. You know, nowadays we'd say she's a very troubled individual who's probably suffering from PTSD from her abuse as a 13-year-old. But then they said, no, she must be sterilized because she is feeble-minded. A petition was filed with the State Board of Social Protection after she, quote, engaged in a series of indiscriminate and impulsive sexual involvements while at the state hospital. And the court upheld the order of sterilization, and noting that the state's concern for the welfare of its citizenry extends to future generations, and when there is overwhelming evidence, as there is here, that a potential parent will be unable to provide proper environment for a child because of his own mental illness or mental retardation, the state has sufficient interest to order sterilization. 1972. But note that it was for the good of society. That was the importance of it. The last reported Court of Appeals decision was in 1974. It was, in this case, Triplett v. State Board of Social Protection. And it really was just like an evidentiary issue that is really boring. But so I was giving this presentation once at the University of Oregon Law School. Afterwards, an attorney came up to me and said, I came to Oregon to practice back in the late 70s from the East Coast. And she said, and she was a defense attorney. And she said one of the first cases she had, the prosecutor came up to her, and this was, I think, in Douglas County. The prosecutor came up to her and said, hey, listen, I will give your client a really good deal if she agrees to be sterilized. And this attorney was like, I couldn't believe like someone had said that to me. And apparently that's what was still going on in the late 70s, that, you know, if your client agrees to sterilization and consents to this, then we will give her a good deal. That was really startling. The legislature finally ended the policy of forced sterilization in 1983. Although the Board of Social Protection had been, you know, not really doing much from about 1975 onward, it sounds like. The bill was pushed, was sponsored by then Representative Kitzhaber, and it noted that sterilization procedures are highly intrusive, generally irreversible, and represent potentially permanent and highly significant consequences for individuals incapable of giving informed consent. Really, it did sort of die with a whimper. This is a graph of the number of sterilizations in Oregon over the period of time that we had sterilizations from. Actually, it starts in 1921. This is from that book that I mentioned earlier. And according to this graph, the last procedure looks like it occurred before 1963. But I actually found an Oregonian article that reported the last procedure occurring in 1979. So I'm not sure when the last procedure actually occurred. I think what might have been happening for a while is the State Board of Social Protection was ordering sterilizations, but they weren't actually being carried out, is what I think, kind of like the death penalty in Oregon. no one ever actually gets executed. The greatest number of sterilization procedures occurred in 1937 with 44. Again, that was that time when everyone was really pushing for sterilization. And you can see that it sort of leveled off in the 50s and 60s as it sort of diminished. There is some disagreement about the final toll. This record indicates 2,341, but when the governor issued his apology that we'll get to in a moment in 2002, he indicated a total of 2,648. So the final number is still debated. 65% of the individuals who were sterilized in Oregon were women. 35 were men. So again, it was targeting a lot of these promiscuous women who offended kind of the moral sensibilities of others. Around 60% of those were deemed, of the people who were forced to be sterilized, were deemed feeble-minded. And between 1918 and 1941, 68% of the male victims were castrated. Just a phenomenal number. Governor Kitzhaber issued an apology in 2002. And he noted that during the early decades of the last century, the doctrine of eugenics gained widespread support in scientific circles, philosophy, and government. First expressed by a British scientist named Francis Galton in the 1800s, the doctrine sought to improve the human condition by simply breeding better humans. The method was to encourage reproduction by people with, quote, good genes, while discouraging reproduction of those with, quote, bad genes. At various times, supporters of eugenics urged passage of laws to keep ethnic groups separate from one another, to restrict immigration to America by people from Eastern and Southern Europe, and to impose sterilization on those considered, quote, unfit. So this was published, I wrote an article that was published in the Oregon State Bar Bulletin a few years ago. That's when I originally started working on this. And in response to that, someone wrote a letter that asked, what is Oregon doing now that might later be seen as terribly unjust from a more enlightened point of view? And that kind of got me thinking, and it's interesting to think about those things. Some things that popped into my mind now are like the treatment of juvenile offenders, how we treat juvenile offenders, now that we're learning about brain science, lack of mental health treatment in our system, punitive rather than rehabilitative sentences. But so I wrote this article, I did this research around 2016. And this is before the emergence of Donald Trump. Well, not the emergence of Donald Trump, the emergence of President Trump, I should say. And honestly, returning to the topic now, after about a year and a half, was kind of jolting when I started reading some of these documents that I hadn't read for a few years. When I wrote the article, I wondered, how did the country go down that pathway? I mean, there were rational people. How did they let this happen? And now I kind of ask, have we really moved that far from the 1920s in terms of acceptance of others? Race, religion, disabilities, the LGBTQ community, how far have we gotten? Really deep down. I'm not talking on the surface. On the surface, there's a lot of good language, but really deep down, how far have we come? When you have the president referring to Mexicans as bad people, African countries as shitholes, you wonder how far have we gotten? And the eugenics movement in the early 1900s started with limiting immigration, and now we have very similar things happening. So I'm going to end with 3 quotes, and I'll just let you read them. Thank you. I guess we will have question and answer session now. So I actually can't really see. I'm going to take this microphone and move over here so I can actually be out of. Oh, be out of the light so I can see people. Oh, Liza, here.
When people ask you a question, if you could repeat it into the microphone.
Repeat the question into the microphone. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Yes, there was a big phrenology movement in Europe. Does this relate to this in any way?
There was a big phrenology movement in Europe, and does this relate to this anyway? Phrenology being the study of head shape and things like that. Is that yeah? This was related. It was all this idea of we can use science to better understand humans, and so it was the kind of initial attempt at understanding the science of genetics, that the size of your head could mean certain things. So it was all related. It never came, well, when they did the best baby, the better baby contest, they did measure the heads. So there was some of that going on here as well.
Because there's no mention of this in any of these documents.
There's no mention of phrenology in the documents. No, and I never came upon phrenology specifically. It was going on in this country, but not related to what I was looking at. Yeah.
So I got my history degree from WSU Vancouver last year. And I was wondering if you've come across any of the documentation during LBJ's time in office from 64 to 72. During the Great Society movement, more than 2,000 black women were forcibly sterilized, or they would lose their welfare benefits. And for that 8-year period, that was run by Captain Shriver, and Donald Rumsfeld. So,
interesting. I don't know how to hear that, but the individual who just got a degree, congratulations, from WSU Vancouver in history. She noted that during LGB's time, from the 1964 to about 1972, there were thousands, did you say?
2,000.
2,000 African-American women who were forced to be sterilized or lose their benefits, and was being run by Sergeant Shriver and Donald Rumsfeld. Yeah, I mean, this isn't that long ago. We're not talking ancient history here. Thanks.
You mentioned there was something that occurred between, I think, the years 29 and 42 to bring about a change of attitude toward the policy. Do you have any idea what that change of attitude was? Because I'm wondering what change of attitude we're going to have to be looking for in order to see a change of policy, and how long we may have to wait.
The question was, I mentioned that between 1929, the Buck v. Bell decision, and 1942, the Skinner v. Oklahoma decision, I mentioned that something changed in society and wondering what it was and when will we see something like that. What I think changed in society, well, I think partially the makeup of the Supreme Court changed, but that isn't entirely the reason. I think World War II, and I think what we were finding out about what was going on in Germany, and I think some people started holding up a mirror, seeing Germany as a mirror to our own society, that, Germany was basing its eugenics movement on the American eugenics movement, just, again, taking it much further than was taken here, and I think that was a big shift. So, hopefully we don't need to have that again, but that was, I think that's what the shift was, personally. Other questions? Yes?
Is the legal challenge to forced sterilization, it's only equal protection, it's not cruel and unusual punishment?
Was the only challenge equal protection, not cruel and unusual punishment? In the Oregon case in 1921, there was actually a number of different arguments made, and cruel and unusual punishment was one. And the court decided it on the equal protection grounds. Again, the statute specifically said this isn't punishment. And so that was the way around that. And probably the court saw that this was the easiest way to resolve it. So there was not a decision on cruel and unusual punishment. Other questions back there?
Kind of bouncing off of that, a lot of the language in those court cases reminds me a lot of later court cases in the 60s and 70s, like Griswold v. Connecticut and Roe v. Wade. Do you think legally, from a constitutional
Do I think that challenging forced sterilization, a better challenge would be due process or equal protection? It depends on the process that's given in the case. I think I'd have to look at, I'm getting all lawyerly here. I'd have to look at sort of what process was given to the person to determine whether it was a good due process case. In a case where, there was a lot of process given, I might make that argument, but I might rely more heavily on equal protection as opposed to a case where there isn't much in the way of due process. Interestingly, you noted that looking at a case like Griswold v. Connecticut and Roe v. Wade, one thing I didn't mention that's another fascinating part of this is the people who are supportive of forced sterilization were also some of the early supporters of abortion, of the right to get an abortion. The early, I guess you'd call them the pro-choice movement, were some of the same people, and which is weird because one of them, on the one hand, is like women should have the right to choose. On the other hand, it's like we are going to force you to be sterilized. And I think I've reconciled that by understanding that at that time, the people who were advocating for right to choose, family planning as it were more targeting the upper and middle class, as opposed, because they were like, oh, we can, that's good for them, for us, but for them, we don't trust the others, those others to be using family planning, so we're going to use forced sterilization on them. That's the only way I've reconciled it, but I'm not sure. But there is definitely that connection between the two historically.
Sorry, are there some states that are still practicing forced sterilization, like specifically sexual predators?
Are there some states that are still practicing forced sterilization for sexual predators? There are, and I don't know if there's any states, I've seen articles about chemical castration, which would be some kind of chemical, and I'm not sure how it works, that basically takes away any sex drive and inhibits, I guess, the hormones. But no state that I know of is doing actual physical sterilization. There is actually still a law in Oregon that allows for forced sterilization with a court order. Like someone would have to go to court, and I'm not sure when it would come up. I've never seen a case on it. The only thing I can figure out is if someone sort of was a guardian to an individual and the individual couldn't consent, the guardian could go to a court and get a court order. That's the only way I figured it out, but I'm not sure if it's ever happened. But there's still a law in the books in Oregon that allows for sterilization. But again, I haven't seen it. All the way in the back.
I remember hearing the last couple of years about some programs that were paying women to have IUDs in place when they were going through substance abuse issues. Do you know much about that, or is it practice or challenges with that?
The person said that she's heard of situations where women were forced to...
Not forced, but given the option.
Given the option of using an IUD while they're going through drug rehabilitation treatment, and are there any challenges to that? I'm not familiar with that, so I'd say if it was optional and they chose to do it, I don't know that there would be much to challenge.
They were compensated monetarily.
They were compensated monetarily, so then it might not be voluntary if someone says, no, we'll give you this money to do that, but I'm not familiar with those programs. Other questions?
You ended with quotes, so I'll start my question with one. This is a quote from Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She said, "We don't want the word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population." What connection does eugenics have to Planned Parenthood?
So the person said a quote that Margaret Sanger, who's an early proponent of abortion rights, said. Can you repeat it again? Birth control. Thank you. Birth control.
Planned Parenthood. She started
Planned Parenthood. Yes.
That's the reason that Planned Parenthood is congressionally funded, is because Margaret Sanger came to Congress and said there are people that shouldn't replicate.
So Margaret.
And her quote is, "We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population." This is in a letter, so it's in writing, To Dr. Clarence Gamble, dated December 10th, 1939.
I don't know if everyone could hear that, but it's like I said, there is definitely an interesting connection that I didn't explore too deeply between the early pro-choice movement and birth control and family planning and eugenics, but I've not really drilled down deeply into that aspect of it.
What did she say?
Oh, let me see if I can.
She's got a lot. I can send it to you. But the quote that I quoted was,
There's a microphone. Keep up my microphone.
the thing that I said, she has a lot. So if anyone wants to know what she said, I can send it to you. But specifically she said, which prompted my question, we don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And this was in a letter, so it's in writing, to Dr. Clarence Gamble, dated December 10th, 1939.
Now, would that imply that they are still under that ideology, or that is just one individual who may have started it, but was just clearly out of mind?
This is my opinion, but you can double check me on the facts here.
There's no argument to that she said that, but that they might actually still follow that ideology.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move on to more questions.
If you read the entire statement that was just quoted, that's not what she said.
Well, everyone can read the statement on their own and
Okay,
come
but
to the
I do have another question.
Sure.
The forced sterilizations, there can be some quibbling about whether consent was given or whether it was actually forced. One question I have is, were all of those performed on individuals that were institutionalized? Were there ever sterilizations that were done for people that were not institutionalized?
Yeah, I think probably yes. I didn't find the records of that because the records that exist, like I said, are limited, and those were of people who were institutionalized.
So it was really common in Appalachia, actually.
It was someone said it was common in Appalachia for those people to be sterilized who were not in some kind of institution. Again, I didn't have those records,
Okay.
so.
Well, one of the categories that made someone a candidate for sterilization was epilepsy.
Mhm.
And I was really interested as to whether that was ever practiced or if someone wound up in an institution because of that condition and therefore were candidates for sterilization.
Yeah. So the question was, one of the categories was epilepsy, and the questioner was wondering whether people were institutionalized for epilepsy or if they were sterilized while not being institutionalized. In fact, they were institutionalized for epilepsy. Many of the institutions for feeble-mindedness were actually the institution for the feeble-minded and epileptic. So they were institutionalized.
Is there a greater proportion of minorities who are sterilized than to the general population?
Is there a greater proportion of minorities who are sterilized in relation to the population? I didn't have racial makeup, so none of the statistics I had broke it down that way. So I couldn't say one way or the other what the numbers were.
Historically, during the 1920s, KKK was quite prominent in Oregon, and it seems to correlate with this program time-wise. I'm just wondering, is there a correlation between membership in the KKK and those that were promoting this?
The questioner noted that at that same time, in the 1920s, the KKK in Oregon was gaining strength, and wondering if there was a connection between those who are promoting eugenics and sterilization and the KKK. Probably there was. I know Governor Martin, I think, was connected to the KKK, if I remember correct. What's it? Pierce, right, Pierce, thank you. Was connected to the KKK, and he was a promoter of eugenics. So from that point, yes, but I can't say who else was involved with both.
You want to take one more question?
One more question in the back.
Do you know if this still happens in other countries?
Does this still happen in other countries? I could say probably yes. I can't point to any specifics, but I could say there's probably programs in other countries that do some form of forced sterilization, but I don't have examples. Thank you. This was very interesting.